Ken, we have now had the House January 6th committee hearings. We had the initial special counsel election indictment, and now this updated factual proffer. What's new in here?
Good morning, Anna. As you said, we have all that information, but this is a 165-page document with new evidence that reads almost like a novel. And there's a lot of interesting new tidbits, including in the immediate aftermath of the election, even as the votes were being counted. There's testimony that Trump staffers were talking about concocting protests after the so-called Brooks Brothers riot that happened in 2000, and one is quoted as saying, make them riot. And then you have a Trump staffer testifying that Donald Trump himself was overheard telling family members, whether you win or lose, you have to fight like hell, suggesting that even if he knew he lost, he would still try to fight to stay in power, which is exactly what the special counsel says he did and broke the law by doing so. But the most interesting revelations really come around his interactions with Vice President Mike Pence, and they're based on 5 pages of contemporaneous notes that the January 6th committee, as far as we know, did not have access to and that we've never really seen before. And it's absolutely fascinating. It portrays Mike Pence as trying to gently and gradually convince Donald Trump that he lost and that it would be okay to leave the White House, and that they could consider it an intermission. He could run again. And then it shows that Trump turning against Pence when it became clear that Pence was not going to try to stop the certification on January 6th. And then it takes us right up to the moment when the rioters were pouring into the Capitol, and Donald Trump was told that Mike Pence was in danger and told at one point that he had been evacuated to a secure location, and the aides were hoping that the president would order some kind of action to protect his vice president. And this document quotes Donald Trump as saying, so what?
So that's a lot alone, and it's just scratching the surface of what is in here. Vaughn, what are we hearing from Trump and his campaign? Have they disputed any of the facts of this filing?
No, not at this point. For the Trump campaign, I think you just turn attention to Donald Trump's social media. Literally just minutes after this filing was publicly released, Donald Trump, he began posting on his social media account saying in part that it's a falsehood-ridden, unconstitutional J6 brief. Now, it's worth noting that Donald Trump, though, is not refuting any of the actual substance of what is inside of this document. He is not refuting that he put pressure on Vice President Pence or other Republican lawmakers like Georgia Governor Brian Kemp and Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, which is outlined inside of this filing. And it does not include any refuting of his conversations that he had with the likes of Ronna McDaniel, the RNC chairwoman, or with close ally Steve Bannon or other advisors to his campaign. At the same time, we expect, based off of a request from Trump's lawyers, they have sought from Judge Chutkan to have an additional 5 weeks added on for them to be able to respond with their own filing to the Jack Smith filing. So, of course, this all comes down to we don't expect much movement here before Election Day on this. But at this point in time, it's up to Donald Trump and his campaign to respond in kind. And instead of actually refuting specifics as part of this 160-page filing, Donald Trump is just outright dismissing it in its entirety in the mere basis that the indictment was brought against him.
Christy, the special counsel must prove that this case all involves private conduct, that it has nothing to do with then President Trump's official acts, right? So that was because of the Supreme Court's ruling. Based on this new filing and what you're reading here, does it look like Jack Smith's case is harder to prove?
No, I think based on what he has set forth here, he has set forth a lot of different categories of conduct that seem to be plainly private. He talks, for example, about Donald Trump's interactions with various state officials, and he paints a really dismal picture where Donald Trump is right in the center of it. He is out there not only trying to peddle all kinds of knowingly bogus election fraud claims, but when the various officials in these states say, no, that's not true, we're not going to overturn our elections, we're going to follow our process, Donald Trump then starts to, publicly attack them and retaliate against them. And it's numerous people. It's governors, it's House speakers, it's state legislatures. I mean, it's really striking to see. And it's, how in the world could the Supreme Court look at that conduct, this bullying, and telling people not to do their jobs and say that is somehow within his presidential authority. The president has no authority to engage in what states do and how they certify their their votes. So again, that's just one example, but there are many, many examples throughout this where Jack Smith really gets into the details and really paints a very clear picture as to why this is unofficial conduct.
Yeah, speaking of details, there's a lot of new detail in here about Donald Trump's pressure campaign against his then VP, Mike Pence. And the Supreme Court made it very hard for Trump's pressure campaign involving Mike Pence for that to be a part of this case, right? Private conversations between a president and a vice president. But Smith argues because the executive branch has no role in the certification proceeding, and indeed the president was purposely excluded from it by design, prosecuting the defendant for his corrupt efforts regarding Pence poses no danger to the executive branch's authority or functioning. Is getting the Pence interactions into the trial the highest bar for the special counsel to clear here, and how important is that to this case?
I think it is a very, very high bar, Anna. And I think that one of the things that Jack Smith understands is that he cannot put all of his eggs in that basket. If he is able to get, for example, those notes and those conversations in as part of his case in chief, that gives him a huge leg up in terms of establishing the fact that these people were not acting in any official capacity. They were running mates. They were talking about a campaign, and that's what they were trying to secure, was a victory that Donald Trump knew he had lost. However, what this brief lays out very, very clearly is that if you take that stuff away, I have enough, as far as the prosecution is concerned, to put on the table in front of a jury or in front of a judge to establish that Donald Trump knew that he had lost and he was engaged on his own in another campaign that involved no official acts connected to what his responsibilities as the president are. And I think that that's important to understand. If you have the stuff with Mike Pence, I can move forward, and it helps a lot. But if I don't, I still have more than enough to make out my case and convict Donald Trump for what he has done on January 6th.
This filing also zooms in on Trump's use of Twitter. And I write, and I'm quoting here, the phone's activity logs show that the defendant was using his phone on January 6th, and in particular using the Twitter application consistently throughout the day after he returned from the Ellipse speech. Christy, the special counsel wants to introduce this at trial using an FBI forensic expert. What do you think the prosecutors are trying to show with this?
Well, again, they're trying to show that on January 6th, Donald Trump is actively involved himself, not having some aide do it. He is himself tweeting, and the tweets are, spreading election fraud even on that day, leading up to it. And on that day, he is trying to retaliate and pressure Mike Pence to not certify those votes. He is rallying his base. He's inflaming his base. There is one tweet in particular at 2:24 that day on January 6th, where he says that Mike Pence lacks courage. That's when he already knew that the Capitol had been breached. And then he finds out that that could potentially harm him, that Jack Smith refers to that tweet as a powder keg, knowing that that could be putting Mike Pence in danger. And then sure enough, he says, so what, when he's provided with information that he had to be moved to a secure location. So these tweets are very important evidence. And again, if you're spreading election fraud, if you're trying to pressure Mike Pence, if you're trying to retaliate against your opponents and rally your base, none of that is presidential duties. All of that is what he is doing as a candidate to try to overturn the election results.
Charles, Ken mentioned this incident in Detroit where votes were being counted the day after the election, and there was this pro-Trump group that was there on site and looking to cause some chaos. Quote, when the colleague, and this is a colleague of Trump's, he's saying, when a colleague suggested that there was about to be unrest reminiscent of the Brooks Brothers riot, an unnamed campaign employee responded, make them riot and do it. Prosecutors, I guess, say this isn't just one example of some of Trump's private operatives trying to create chaos, intending to have some kind of a riot, but do they have to prove that Trump was behind that specifically if this is the indictment against Trump himself?
Well, there has to be a connection at some level between Donald Trump and these actions, not necessarily that he specifically directed them to do this specific act. However, with respect to the ultimate goal that Donald Trump sought to accomplish, which was decertifying or preventing the certification or disrupting the elective process in 2020, if that is found to be in the common scheme of what Donald Trump was advancing, then that is going to be sufficient for Jack Smith to move forward. So the specific acts in terms of how it's accomplished is not necessarily something that Jack Smith has to establish beyond sort of presenting a case that basically ties in. We all were acting in this common goal, and we were all clear about the common goal, and that was set forth in advance by the former president.
Ken, Trump's been complaining about the timing of this brief being made public. Set the record straight for us. Did Jack Smith have any control over the timing of this release?
In the immediate term, he did not. This was a decision by the judge to unseal a sealed filing. The special counsel's office didn't even know this was going to be happening yesterday. Now, there's a larger issue here where you can question whether Jack Smith could have done something to avoid this happening until after the election, could have asked the judge for more time. But the Justice Department's position here is this does not violate any guidelines. They have a case to litigate. The Supreme Court has asked that this procedure happen to sort out what's private and what's official, and that they need to move forward. And Judge Tanya Chutkan has made clear that she believes the election has no bearing on how this case should be handled. And the special counsel's office felt that it had no choice but to comply with Judge Chutkan's request.